This is section 1A for Math 154, Living in the Media Age. We're going to talk about arguments and figuring out what the argument is, as well as its premise and conclusions, recognizing common fallacies, and figuring out media information to determine whether it can be trusted or not. So we are currently living in the media age because we're always in constant contact with some kind of media, and we rely on this media for all kinds of information. And people will form opinions and beliefs based on these media sources. So we need to look at this and figure out, is the media inaccurate or biased and intended to convince us of something that may or may not be true? So we need to make sense of modern media information. And to do so, we need media literacy, which is a deep understanding of the many ways in which people may try to manipulate your views. So let's take a look at these comments that are pulled from some website. You might see a discussion, something like this. Ethan says the death penalty is immoral. Jessica says, no, it isn't. And Ethan says, yes, it is. Judges who give the death penalty should be impeached. Jessica says, you don't even know how the death penalty is decided. Ethan says, I know a lot more than you do. Jessica says, I can't talk to you, you're an idiot. This type of argument is pretty common, and it doesn't really accomplish anything. It does not give the person insight into the other's thinking, and it's unlikely to change either person's opinion. So let's talk about better ways to argue. When we talk about logic, we're talking about the study of methods and principles of reasoning. An argument uses a set of facts or assumptions called premises to support a conclusion. And a fallacy is a deceptive argument and an argument where the conclusion is not well supported by the premises. We can use logic skills to argue a position which may or may not actually change someone else's views, but it does allow people to understand each other better. So in logic, an argument is a reasoned or thoughtful process. Some arguments provide strong support for their conclusions, others do not. An argument that fails to make a compelling case for its conclusion may contain some kind of error in reasoning. So an error in reasoning is a fallacy. A fallacious argument tries to persuade in a way that doesn't really make sense when it's analyzed carefully. So let's talk about some of the common fallacies. Fallacies are so common, it's almost impossible to avoid them. So what we want to do is we want to be able to recognize them and say, that's not a good argument because it has a fallacy. They sound persuasive despite logical errors, in part because public relations specialists have spent billions of dollars researching how to persuade us to buy products, vote for candidates, support particular policies. Each of these fallacies has a name. Learning the names is not as important as learning to recognize that there is faulty reasoning. So our first fallacy is to appeal to popularity or appeal to the majority. So this would be something like, most people believe P is true, therefore P is true. And we'll look at plenty of examples of these. So the false cause or post hoc would be something that's A came before B, therefore A caused B. Then we have the appeal to ignorance. There is no proof that P is true, therefore it is false. A hasty generalization. A and B are linked one or few times, therefore A causes B. And I know that this sounds fairly similar to the false cause or post hoc. So we'll see the difference here is the timeline. See how false cause says A came before B, whereas, and I'll highlight that, A came before B, whereas hasty generalization just says that they're linked. Limited choices or false dilemma. P is false, therefore only Q can be true. So the idea here is that there are only two choices. It's like, hey, there's P or there's Q. But in reality, there could be a whole lot more choices. They're only presenting you with two. Appeal to emotion or appeal to force. P is associated with positive emotional response, therefore P is true. A personal attack or ad hominem. I have a problem with the person or the group claiming P, therefore P is not true. Remember, you need to keep the person making the argument separate from the argument itself. So that would be what we were looking up here with Ethan and Jessica. When Jessica says, "You're an idiot," that has nothing to do with Ethan's argument. She's attacking the person. Circular reasoning, P is true. P is restated in different words. So the argument states the conclusion. A diversion or a red herring is P is related to Q, and I have an argument concerning Q, therefore P is true. Straw man, I have an argument concerning a distorted version of P, therefore I hope you're fooled into concluding that I have an argument concerning the real version of P. I know these the definitions feel kind of confusing, and I think that it will make more sense as we dig into the examples. So we're going to look at the argument. We're going to identify the premise and the conclusion, and then we're going to determine the fallacy that is illustrated by this argument. So Gwen says, you should stop drinking because it's hurting your grades, causing behavior that endangers people around you, and destroying your relationships with your family. Meryl says, I've seen you drink a few too many on occasion yourself. So the premise, I'm not going to rewrite all of this. I'm going to go ahead and highlight. So I'll highlight the premise in yellow, and I'll highlight the conclusion in blue. So our premise is that drinking is hurting your grades, causing behavior, and destroying your relationship with your family. And our conclusion is that you should stop drinking. So now the fallacy, we're going to look at Meryl's response. That's where we're going to find the fallacy. I've seen you drink a few too many on occasion yourself. That is a personal attack. So the fact that Gwen has also had a few too many drinks herself has nothing to do with the argument that drinking for Meryl is hurting grades, causing behavior that endangers people, and destroying the relationships with the family. that is why it is a fallacy. The second one, in ads for Michelin tires, a picture of a baby is shown with the words, "Because so much is riding on your tires." So the premise here is something like you care about your child, you love your baby. I should put your baby. You love your baby. And the conclusion is that you should buy Michelin tires. So this one would be an appeal to emotion. They're saying, since you care so much about your child, you need to purchase these kind of tires so that your child is safe. Now, that's kind of a silly argument, right? Because it doesn't mean that purchasing other tires means your kid is not safe. So they're just trying to get the parents emotional and feeling like you need to buy these tires for your baby to be safe. The next one, 2 cases of childhood leukemia have occurred along the street where the high voltage power lines run. The power lines must be the cause of these illnesses. So the premise, this one again is pretty well stated in here, so I'm going to highlight them. Our premise is 2 cases of childhood leukemia have occurred along the street where high voltage power lines run. Our conclusion is the power lines must be the cause of these illnesses. This is a hasty generalization. And remember, I said that this one, hasty generalization, is fairly close to false cause or post hoc, but we didn't have a timeline here of something came before the other event. It's just that the 2 things are linked. So that's why it's a hasty generalization. Of course, it is a fallacy because we have no idea what caused these 2 cases of childhood leukemia. It could have been, a boatload of things, or just a weird fluke. So we can't say that the power lines are the cause. The next one says we should not continue to fund cloning research because there are so many ethical issues involved. Strong ethical foundations are necessary to the proper functioning of society, so we cannot afford to have too many ethical loose ends. So I'm going to highlight again. The premise is strong ethical foundations are necessary to the proper functioning of society, so we cannot afford to have too many ethical loose ends. The conclusion is we should not continue to fund cloning research. So you might be thinking, okay, why did the conclusion come before the premise in this case? Because the other 2 ones, actually the first one did that. The premise came before the conclusion. you need to understand that the conclusion is the action that needs to be taken. So for the first one, you should stop drinking. That's the action that needs to be taken. For this one, we should not continue to fund cloning research. That's an action to be taken. I mean, I know this one feels a little different because it's the power lines must be the cause of these illnesses. So that's not exactly an action to be taken. But it's what we are concluding from the premise. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. For this one, our fallacy would be diversion. So remember, diversion was, here it is. We talked about P is related to Q, and then I have an argument concerning Q, therefore P is true. So since strong ethical foundations are necessary to the proper functioning of society, and we can't have too many ethical loose ends, we should not continue to fund cloning research. I would say that's one of the more tricky fallacies. Scientists have not found any concrete evidence of aliens visiting Earth. Therefore, anyone who claims to have seen a UFO must be hallucinating. So our premise is that there is no evidence. I'll just highlight it again. Scientists have not found any concrete evidence of aliens. And our conclusion is anyone who claims to have seen a UFO must be hallucinating. So this one is an appeal to ignorance. We're just saying, let's go ahead and scroll back up and look at exactly what that appeal to ignorance looked like. Since there is no proof that P is true, P is false. So they're saying, since there is no proof that aliens exist or that aliens have visited Earth, then anyone who has seen the UFO must be incorrect. Ford makes the best pickup trucks in the world. More people drive Ford pickups than any other light truck. So this one is another one where the premise is the second part. More people drive Ford pickups than any other light truck. Therefore, conclusion, Ford makes the best pickup trucks in the world. And this one is going to be an appeal to popularity. And you might be wondering on this one why the premise can't be Ford makes the best pickup trucks in the world, and the conclusion is more people drive Ford pickups than any other light truck. Think about, can the statement stand alone and be true? The premise should be something that is a true argument. We can measure that more people drive Ford pickups than any other light truck. That is a numerical statement that we can determine. We cannot determine Ford makes the best pickup trucks in the world. You might think so, and that's fine, but that's going to be more of an opinion factor than the straight up, hey, this is a fact. So that's a good way to determine the premise versus the conclusion. Think about, could this be a true argument that can stand alone? The next one, you don't support the president, so you are not a patriotic American. So the premise is you don't support the president. Again, think about it as a measurable statement. The premise you don't have to argue with. You don't support the president. I mean, that's probably something like you didn't vote for this person. So that's kind of a measurable statement. And then the conclusion is you are not a patriotic American. Now, you are not a patriotic American. That's not really something that we can determine easily. This one would be limited choice. So you're saying that the person either supports the president and therefore they're patriotic, or if they don't support the president, then they're not patriotic. You're limiting them to these two options. Of course, the other option would be you could be a patriotic American who doesn't support the current president. But in this case, the argument, the fallacy is not allowing you to have that option. I placed the quartz crystal on my forehead, and in 5 minutes, my headache was gone. The crystal made my headache go away. So the premise is, again, just the facts, what happens. So the premise is going to be that I placed the quartz crystal on my forehead, and in 5 minutes, my headache was gone. The conclusion is the crystal made my headache go away. This is going to be the false cause. So this one was the one that was close, or you could also call it post hoc. It's close to hasty generalization, but it has that timeline. So since I placed it on my forehead and 5 minutes later the headache was gone, that's what makes that false cause as opposed to the hasty generalization. Society has an obligation to provide health insurance because healthcare is a right to citizenship. So the premise here is that healthcare is a citizen's right. This one's kind of honestly very confusing to find the premise and the conclusion, because they're so similar. So society, what did I say? Healthcare is a right to citizenship. Again, if you mix these up, it would be totally fine because they're basically the same. Society has an obligation to provide health insurance. And that's circular reasoning, where you're like, okay, the premise and the conclusion are basically saying the same thing. So suppose the mayor of a large city proposed decriminalizing drug possession in order to reduce overcrowding in jails and save money on enforcement. His challenger in the upcoming election says, the mayor doesn't think there's anything wrong with the drug use, but I do. So the premise is going to be that the mayor is proposing decriminalizing drug possession. And you could include in order to reduce overcrowding, blah, blah, blah. But that is what is going on. The conclusion is that the mayor doesn't think there's anything wrong with drug use. So this is a straw man argument. And the straw man is distorting the person's argument. So you're taking what this mayor has said, that he wants to decriminalize drug possession, and now you're turning it into he doesn't think there's anything wrong with drug use. That wasn't the first mayor's argument. So that's why it's a straw man. You're taking the actual argument and kind of fleshing it out to be a weaker argument that you can easily knock down. So there are more fallacies. This is a small sample of many, many tactics used by individuals, groups, and companies seeking to shape your opinions. Next time you see an ad, think about it and try to figure out, what are they actually saying? Does it make sense? It probably is a fallacy. That's how ads work. When you're looking for information and determining if it's reliable, consider the source. Can you track down the original source if it's not from the original? The more distant the source is from the original, the more misrepresented it could become. And make sure your source is what you actually think it is. Many websites try to look like legitimate news sites, but they're not. Check how recent the information is. Is it still relevant? Can you validate the information from other sources? Is the information trying to manipulate or serve as a hidden agenda? Are they trying to accomplish something? And don't miss the big picture. Does the information make sense? Does it conflict with other things that you think are true? So let's evaluate the Mars claim from the chapter opener. On August 27th, Mars will look as large and bright as the full moon. Don't miss it, because no one alive today will ever see this again. So the original source of the claim is not given. That means you have no idea. You can't verify the source. You should be immediately suspicious. Check the date, no year. It says August 27th. August 27th of when? So you don't know if it is supposed to be, maybe this is an old date, maybe this is an old statement, or maybe it's supposed to be in the future. We want to validate the accuracy. It's very easy to look up. You'll find numerous websites stating that it is untrue. As far as hidden agendas go, I don't think there's any obvious hidden agendas. They're not trying to accomplish something other than, I guess, getting out and seeing Mars on August 27th, but it's just a misstatement of a fact. Don't miss the big picture. Think about it. The moon is always much closer to Earth than Mars. Even at its closest, Mars is about 150 times as far from Earth as the moon. So it doesn't really make sense that Mars would ever be as large and bright in our sky as the full moon. And there's the little tidbit on the side here that this is actually known as the Mars hoax. It's a common claim. It can be as bright or brighter than any star in our night sky for several weeks. It happens about every 26 months. But I think we can all imagine seeing something like this online and, just being like, oh, wow, that's cool. I'm going to go check that out. And obviously this claim doesn't have serious repercussions if you go outside on August 27th and check and it's not actually a bright Mars. Oh, well. But it's one of those things that when you don't stop and think, claims like this could, become more dangerous depending on what they're saying. It actually was originally claimed in 2003, and it still circulates frequently 2 decades later. So it is extremely hard to eradicate false claims once they become widespread. I'm sure you can think of other hoaxes or conspiracy theories that still have people believing long after they were first circulated. So here's some tips for fact-checking on the web. There are some websites you can use for political fact-checking and for rumors, urban myths, and other odd claims, as well as the validity of messages you receive through social media. Hopefully, we have a little bit more of an understanding of arguments, premises, conclusions, and fallacies at this point.